Imagine a nation born with a promise of freedom for all, but built on a lie. A nation that declared independence, but kept millions of its own people in chains. It would take a brutal, bloody civil war and the will of one truly extraordinary man to even begin to set things right. This is his story, and the story of the divided house he was born to save. In 1858, a lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln said these words. And you have to understand, he wasn't just talking about politics. He was looking at the very soul of America and seeing a fatal crack running right down the middle. That one sentence, that simple truth, basically set the stage for everything that was about to happen. I mean, just think about the contradiction. America fights a revolution for its own freedom from a king, and then turns around and builds a country where millions are enslaved? From day one, the United States wasn't really united at all. It was a house divided right from the start. So, into this young, deeply troubled, and contradictory America, a child is born. Not in some fancy estate, but on the rugged frontier, about as far from the halls of power as you can get. And yet somehow, he was destined to take on this nation's original sin. This was Abraham Lincoln's world, and it was a tough one. We're talking a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor, no windows. Life on the Kentucky frontier wasn't about getting ahead, it was about surviving. It was a daily fight, where the line between making it and not was razor thin. And then, when he was just 9 years old, his world completely fell apart. His mother, Nancy, the woman who had taught him right from wrong, died from a terrible illness. That kind of loss, at that age, it leaves a scar that never really fades. It filled his childhood with a kind of deep, personal sadness. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because out of all that hardship, something else started to grow. A quiet, fierce determination. This next part of his life isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about a kid with nothing deciding to build himself into someone. Get this. In his entire life, Abraham Lincoln had less than a year of formal schooling. Total. For him, a classroom was a luxury he just couldn't afford. His days were spent doing back-breaking work, like splitting logs for fences and plowing fields. So how on earth does that boy become one of the greatest writers in American history? He teaches himself. He would read anything he could get his hands on, usually by the light of the fireplace. He'd borrow books from anyone who would lend one. He didn't have paper, so he'd practice writing on wooden boards. Word by word, book by book, he literally built his own education from scratch. You know, in this part of his story, a real hero emerges. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston. She saw that this wasn't just some ordinary farm boy. She saw the fire in his eyes, that incredible hunger to learn. She encouraged it, nurtured it, and her support was absolutely everything. When he was 19, his education took a very different, very harsh turn. He took a flatboat of goods down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and there he saw it. The slave markets. He saw human beings, men, women, children, being sold like cattle. It shook him to his core and planted a deep, quiet hatred for slavery that would stay with him for the rest of his life. You've heard the nickname Honest Abe, right? Well, it wasn't some campaign slogan. He earned it as a young man working in a shop. The stories are legendary. He once walked for miles just to return a few pennies to a customer he'd overcharged. That's who he was. His integrity was the bedrock of everything he would become. You know, this journey from hardship to this deep moral clarity, it's just so powerful. If you're finding Lincoln's story of resilience as compelling as I do, I think you'll really love our explainer on the life of another incredible thinker who wrestled with big ideas, the philosopher Leo Tolstoy. We've put the link up above for you. So he decides to get into politics. And his first try, at age 23, he lost. But for Lincoln, failure wasn't a stop sign, it was a detour. He didn't give up, he just worked harder. He dove into books on law and grammar. He lost, he learned, and then he tried again. And in 1834, he won. A couple years after that, he passed the bar exam after teaching himself law. For a while, Lincoln focused on his law career, but the country was a ticking time bomb, and in the 1850s, the fuse was lit. A new law was passed that threatened to let slavery spread everywhere, and it pulled Lincoln back into the fight with a whole new sense of urgency. This was it, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It sounds kind of boring, but this thing was a political earthquake. For decades, there had been a line, the Missouri Compromise, that kept a fragile peace by limiting where slavery could go. This new act just erased that line. For Lincoln, this was a moral disaster. He had to act. And that brings us to the legendary Lincoln-Douglas debates. It was a total clash of titans. You had the famous Stephen Douglas, this polished, powerful senator. And then you had Lincoln, the plain-spoken guy from the frontier, armed with a simple, powerful idea. A house divided against itself cannot stand. See, while Douglas was talking about politics and process, Lincoln cut right to the heart of it. He made it about basic human rights. He argued that no vote, no law, no political compromise could ever make it right for one person to own another. It was simple, it was clear, and it was powerful. And here's the crazy part. After all that, Lincoln lost. He lost the Senate race. But in a weird way, by losing, he actually won something much bigger. Those debates were printed in newspapers all across the country. Suddenly, people everywhere were reading his words. This crushing defeat had somehow put him on the path to the presidency. That newfound fame shot him straight to the Republican nomination for president in 1860. But winning that election would immediately light the fuse on the crisis he'd been warning about for years. It would throw a man with almost zero military experience into the job of commander-in-chief right as the nation was about to tear itself apart. Just look at this election map. It tells you everything you need to know. Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. To the South, this wasn't an election. It felt like a hostile takeover. The House wasn't just divided anymore. For them, it was broken beyond repair. And then, everything fell apart. Fast. One by one, Southern states started leaving the Union. Lincoln begged for calm, saying, "We are not enemies but friends." But it was too late. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The first few years of the war were an absolute disaster for the Union. One terrible defeat after another. Battles with names like Bull Run, Shiloh, and Antietam, which is still the single bloodiest day in all of American history. The pressure on Lincoln was just immense. A lot of people were telling him to just give up. You can just feel the agony in his words, can't you? He was dealing with generals who wouldn't fight. He spent endless nights in the War Department, poring over maps, trying to will his armies to victory. He was carrying the entire weight of the war on his shoulders. But somewhere in all that darkness and defeat, Lincoln had a profound realization. This couldn't just be about putting the old country back together. That country was flawed. No, this war had to be for something bigger, something better. It had to become a fight for a new birth of freedom. And that led to the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a complete game changer. It wasn't just a moral statement, it was a brilliant strategic move. It turned the Union Army into an army of liberation, it allowed black soldiers to join the fight, and it basically made it impossible for countries like Britain to support the South. The war finally had a clear, righteous cause. That cause would be paid for in blood. At Gettysburg in July of 1863, the two armies clashed in the biggest battle of the war. The numbers are just staggering, over 50,000 casualties in 3 days. But the Union won. It was the turning point. A few months later, Lincoln went to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery. The main speaker that day talked for 2 hours. Lincoln got up and spoke for about 2 minutes. And in those 2 minutes, he redefined America. He starts by connecting the soldiers' sacrifice all the way back to the country's founding. And here it is, the promise. He says that their sacrifice will mean something, that out of all this death, the nation will be reborn with a new, truer sense of freedom. He's saying the whole purpose of the country is about to be redefined for the better. And he ends with probably the most famous phrase in American political history. He turned a simple cemetery dedication into this timeless defense of democracy itself. He gave all that suffering a purpose. After Gettysburg, with that new sense of purpose, the tide had turned. The end was now in sight, but it was still a long and grueling road. Lincoln's vision wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about how to heal a nation that had been torn to pieces. Now, it's easy to forget this, but Lincoln almost lost his re-election in 1864. The North was just exhausted by the war.
But then, some key military victories turned public opinion around. And in the end, the people decided to trust the man who had steered them through the storm to see it through to the end.
And he did finish it. On April 9th, 1865, General Lee surrendered. After 4 long, terrible years and over 600,000 lives lost, the war was finally over. The Union was saved. And with the 13th Amendment, slavery, the nation's original sin, was officially and forever destroyed.
The nation was celebrating. There was peace. And at that exact moment, at the absolute peak of his triumph, tragedy struck a final, cruel blow. Just 5 days after the surrender, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. So the boy from the log cabin did it. He saved the Republic. He healed the divided house. But he never got to live in the nation he had rebuilt. And that leaves us with one of the biggest what-ifs in all of history. How might America be different? How might our history have changed if the one man who preached malice toward none with charity for all had been there to guide us through our rebirth?